The Center of the Cyclone, an Autobiography of Inner Space by John C. Lilly, MD. Chapter 1, My First Two Trips, Exploring LSD Spaces and Projections. In this chapter, I'm speaking to those who have yet to experience the outer inner spaces, universes, or body trips that others have experienced by whatever means. I introduce spaces by giving a first-hand account for the first time. I show territories that I have explored. Some are found to be blind alleys, some are found to be of help in making progress for oneself. First of all, I am in a good space. I enjoy telling you about me, about my experiences. I feel here that I am a teacher, a different kind of teacher from those that you've had in school, in college, in graduate school, and so forth. But I am still a teacher. I am a different kind of teacher because I have been there. I haven't gotten it from books. It's not a rehash of the literature. It comes straight from inside me, and I do not feel compelled to teach you what I know. I hear my scientific and medical colleagues objecting to this approach as non-scientific. But those of you who are reading this looking for help will know what I mean. Before I had a deep and high experience for the first time, I had spent several years being trained as a psychoanalyst, several years doing work on the neurophysiology of the brain. I had received the usual medical education and a good basic scientific education at Caltech. I had spent a good deal of time in solitude, isolation, and confinement studies on myself. These experiments were done in darkness, in total silence, floating in neutral buoyancy in a tank of water. Under these circumstances, alone with one's God, one has no alibis. In retrospect, this turned out to be the best possible preparation for my first far-out trip. In the early 50s, I had the opportunity to take LSD, but I didn't take it because I felt I was not yet ready. By the early 60s, I felt prepared enough, and I found an experience-centered guide who loved me enough to conduct the session. During those years, I knew many people who were doing LSD therapy. I knew many people who had been through LSD therapy. I read practically everything that had been published about acid and acid trips. I give you these facts to show you how careful I've been, and also to introduce you to some of the spaces that I went into, in spite of or because of all this preparation. For my first two trips, I had a sitter, a guide, a helper, someone who was there alone with me during the whole trip. A safe, protected location was carefully selected for the experience. I had realized through the solitude, isolation, confinement work in the tank that such an important step as the first trip in acid must be taken without interference, such as accidental interruptions, intervention, and gossip among colleagues and friends. As Freud said 70 years ago, in presenting analyses of his own dreams, at a certain point, one owes discretion to oneself. And I might add, one owes discretion to one's friends. So, a lot of what I have to say here may sound indiscreet, but I believe that we have come a long way since 70 years ago. Today, there are more honest, truthful presentations of inner happenings than there could have been in Freud's time. His work opened up new honesty spaces. I try to be as truthful as I can. There may be those who will try to misuse this information, since we do have a national negative program against LSD. However, so many are now in danger that I would prefer to expose myself to some social criticism rather than further tragedies occur because I didn't speak. My hope here is that those who read this will be more cautious, more informed, and more able, if they must go to the LSD or other such routes, to Satori, Samadhi, Nirvana. My guide was experienced. She had gone through a long period of many trips on LSD in a therapeutic setting. Her therapy took place in the 50s, when acid was still being explored in the therapeutic milieu by professionals. All her sessions and trips had been taken with professionals present, and only pure LSD 25 had been used. In those days, pure lysergic acid diethylamide tartrate was available from the Sandoz company in Switzerland, Sandoz. The material was the purest possible, the isolated dextro form of lysergic acid, diethylene tartrate, uncontaminated with other substances. In those days, you knew what you were getting. It was before street acid, before dishonest substitutions for acid were made, before fake acid was available. In the language of today, it was pure Sandoz. I had known my guide for several years, trusted her, respected her experience, and knew that she could carry me through the trip no matter what happened. I knew she cared for me, respected me, and trusted me. She selected a house in a remote location by the sea. The trip was arranged so there were 48 hours in which to carry it out without interruptions and without commitments or responsibilities on my part or hers outside this trip. We spent a day before the trip working through my hang-ups, what I wished to do under acid, what were my goals, where did I want to go. She indicated in depth that I would be in very strange places, that eventually would become familiar somehow. Later, she indicated that I would probably be moving so fast that I would miss storing some of the experiences, but that the important ones would be remembered. She had already demonstrated her confidence at being able to handle negative emotion coming from me. She had understanding and insight into what I wanted to do. Finally, she had the capacity to let me have my own trip once it got started. She agreed, and not only agreed, but proposed that she stay in the background and be my safety man, and come in only when a suggestion might help. I did not need nor want any programmer who would give me specific directions and would try to move me in various directions. I did not want a therapist. The purpose of that first trip was to experience as many of the possible spaces and effects of acid on me as could be crammed into that session. I wanted to use all my knowledge from my psychoanalysis science and from every other source to experience what acid could do. I found later that most of what I knew through experience and experiment was brought to bear, including knowledge of mathematics, logic, biology, medicine, brain mechanisms, and the functioning of the mind. I brought all of myself to this first session. The session was started in the morning after a good night's sleep. I was thoroughly rested before taking the LSD. I carefully injected 1 cc containing 100 micrograms of pure LSD into the muscle of my thigh. Within 20 minutes, I moved over into the new and strange LSD spaces. I stayed centered, conscious, aware during the whole experience. Within the first 10 minutes of moving into these spaces, I suddenly realized that all my previous trainings leading up to this point, all my preparation, had been worth it. I became high and stayed high for 8 hours. I felt competent, centered, and able to move through any space that I could conceive of. Because of my previous training in isolation tanks, I decided not to wear any clothes on this trip. The environment was such that this was the sage and proper thing to do in order to evolve myself. I had lost my hang-ups about nudity and the necessity of wearing clothes, and I wanted to be completely free and comfortable under these special circumstances. My guide had agreed with this, and being similarly free of such hang-ups was also unclad. This freedom allowed me to make certain kinds of breakthroughs by seeing various projections on my body and on hers. As the LSD began to take effect, I suddenly said in a very loud voice, while pounding on top of a file, "Every psychiatrist, every psychoanalyst should be forced to take LSD in order to know what is over here." What I meant was that anybody who has anything to do with the human mind and its care should be trained in these spaces. The usual things happen, things that had been well written about in the literature by Aldous Huxley and many others: the sudden enhancement and deepening of all color and form, the transparency of real objects, the apparent living nature of material matter, all appeared immediately. I started out by looking at the marble tabletop, and I saw the pattern of the marble become alive, plastic, moving. I moved into the pattern and became part of it, living and moving in the pattern of the marble. I became the living marble. I lay down on the bed between two stereo loudspeakers and went with Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. The music entered into me and programmed me into a deeply religious experience. The whole experience had been programmed and stored in my very early youth, when I was a member of the Catholic Church, serving at Mass and believing with the intense faith of youth in everything that I was learning in the church. I moved into the music, into heaven. I saw God on a tall throne as a giant, wise, ancient man. He was surrounded by angels, choruses, cherubim, and seraphim. The saints were moving by his throne in a stately procession. I was there in heaven, worshiping God, worshiping the angels, worshiping the saints in full and complete transport of religious ecstasy. My guide reported later that I was kneeling on the bed and obviously looking upward into heaven with my hands in a prayer position. Inside, I was kneeling in heaven, seeing, feeling, and living the whole scene. Later, I found that all this took place during the first two movements and most of the chorus of the symphony. The chorus was that of the angels, praising God, worshiping him. Later, when the soprano voices became too strident and too strong, I came back out of that space and asked that the music be shut off. It was too much at that point, and I was exhausted. I had used up my store of energy, and I lay down on the bed and took a short nap. And I'm going to pause here and continue soon.